Thank you for joining us for our midday devotional. I'm Brother Bruce McClure, the local minister at the Prince George's Church of Christ, and we're located at 7800 Central Avenue in Landover, Maryland. Throughout the week, we have focused on the topic of just looking at a general overview of what it means to have proper policing in the United States. And we've covered a litany of topics over the past week that I hope has been informative, that has at least broadened your global look at what policing historically has been in this country and how we got to where we are today. Normally, an individual's present is never an accident, but the road that we travel to get to the present state is often overlooked, or it might be too painful and we just rather not talk about it. So as we've looked over the past several days, we've talked about policing in the early 1800s. We looked at policing during the Reconstruction period following slavery. We also looked at policing during the Civil Rights era, and I think that was important for us to understand as well. And today we will conclude our series by speaking about policing in the United States during this current era of the 2000s. That's where we are now. And I think it's very important that we study how policing is actively done in our generation. When we look at the bridge to the present, there was the Lennox Committee found that the New York Police Department required a $1,600 bribe to be promoted to sergeant and up to $15,000 to be promoted to captain. In 1972, the CAP Commission investigated corruption related to gambling and drugs. And in 1993, the Mullen Commission exposed massive drug corruption, organized theft by police officers, excessive use of force, and police using drugs. That was according to Kapler, Sutler, and Alpert in 1998. Many of you remember the movie Serpico. And remember Peter Serpico, and that movie was released back in 1973. And it was based on the corruption within the New York City police during the 11 years of Serpico's tenure. And he became the whistleblower for the CAP Commission. He saw very quickly upon becoming a police officer that corruption was everywhere. And what he tried to do is to ignore it, but he was perpetually being coerced to take the money, because what his fellow officers understood is if he ever took the bribe just one time, then he could not say that he was better than any of the other police officers, let's say, who had taken the bribes 30 times. Well, Serpico understood if I take the bribe once, then I am just as culpable as they are who've taken the bribe 20 or 30 or 40 times. Uh, but the movie Serpico was based on corruption within the New York City Police Department. Uh, Now, when we talk about community policing, the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Street Acts of 1968, it was designed to provide at least cosmetic police community relationship programs. The 1980s saw some agencies attempting policing. Uh, you said, well, I thought you were going to talk about policing in the 2000s. I am, but I'm linking you to the 2000s. So when you look at this community policing omnibus crime control and safe street acts of 1968, uh, it was sort of the precursor, the forerunner of what was proposed for the current time period, because it was going to focus on working closer with the community by policing being more responsive to the community, and by police engaging and really putting forth energy to alleviate a variety of community problems. Uh, by helping the police, politicians and businesses would come to the realization that police alone have very little favorable impact on lowering crime. That's phenomenal. Police by themselves cannot make a community a better place. It's a matter of impossibility. It's almost like disruptive parents expecting the best school teachers to make scholars out of their disruptive students. And the only support that the students have are the teachers. They have no community support, they have no family support. And all of a sudden, it's all the teacher's responsibility. And that is a setup for failure. But it was nonetheless true if the expectations were for the police to make mature citizens out of delinquent adults or delinquent children. Now, the origin of a presidential task force, that brings us to the current time period. There was a task force on 21st century police reform. Uh, and guess who came up with that task force? On December 18th of 2014, President Barack Obama signed an executive order establishing the task force on 21st century policing. The president charged the task force with identifying best practices and offering recommendations on how policing practices could promote effective crime reduction while building public trust at the same time. Now, there are at least a total of 63 recommendations within that task force's report. Most of the recommendations are directed at the approximately 18,000 state and local law enforcement agencies located throughout the entire United States. Now, I want you to lock in on 2014. A Black president living in diverse communities among diverse populations, who understands inner city, who understands the impact that alienated police from those communities have had and continue to have on neighborhoods, said, let's fix this. Let's take a closer look at how we can better mitigate this problem. I'm going to share with you some excerpts from the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And again, these are just excerpts. You can look up the entire President Task Force on 21st Century Policing by Barack Obama. And it's a short read. It's only about 21 pages. But it's really a good resource to have that you may be able to use as talking points at your local city council meeting, your local community meetings, and among citizens of your own community. Elected officials must work closely together with their city's law enforcement officials to ensure police officers have the support, resources, training they need to serve their communities with honor, integrity, moral character, and courage. So when you hear people talking about, well, they want to get rid of police, and that was not one of the findings of that 21st Century Task Force. The 21st Century Task Force said elected officials must work closely together with their law enforcement officials to ensure police officers have the support. You remember early on, we talked about in the history of policing that the police were basically surrogates of the business community and of the political community. But the police were just there to protect the interest of the politicians and the business communities. That was the agenda. The police were there before they were called police to make sure slaves didn't run away. And if slaves ran away, their task was to catch them. But in the 21st century, elected officials must change their view of police. That's really what this is saying. Elected officials must work closely together with their law enforcement, not just to say, we've got your back, not just to say, we're not going to prosecute you if you do something wrong. That doesn't fix the problem. The elected officials must say to the police department, and we will support you, but we will provide you with resources. We will provide you with proper training so that you can serve these communities with honor, with integrity, and with moral character, and with a courageous outlook to know that if you go into communities with the right attitude, with the right perspective of who you are serving, then the powers that be will support you. However, if you go into these same communities like you are the militia and they're your adversaries, and we know we have trained you, we know we've supported you, we know you have the proper resources, we know you have the mental aptitude. If you go into these communities, basically terrorizing these communities, then we will become a terror to you. See, that's what has to happen in the 21st century. And a signal was sent earlier this week at least in Minneapolis, Minnesota, that said this very point. Let me share with you another excerpt from the president's task force on 21st century policing. Community policing is the concept that trust and mutual respect between police and the communities they serve is critical to public safety. That almost sounds like a mission statement. It is a law enforcement strategy that emphasizes the systematic use of community engagement, partnerships, and problem solving techniques to proactively address conditions that cultivate crime and social disorder. You don't just come on the scene when something happens, but what happens if the police are on the scene when the scene is clear? When it's report card day, when there's a soccer game or a football game or a baseball game, or there's a civic or social event, there are church activities going on Sunday or Saturday. What happens if the police become proactively involved in the community? Community policing emphasizes a guardian, not warriors mindset that can significantly benefit both police officers and the community they serve. Collaborating with the community members to identify needs, establish the best practices, and provide feedback for law enforcement is common practice. That was found in 2014 from a task force on 21st century policing. Community policing requires cooperation among the police, citizens, local decision makers in order to forge effective partnerships that combat criminal activity. This was found in 2014. These were the task force's 6 recommendations. And again, if you look up the entire task force little pamphlet, 21 pages, it's going to expand on these 6 recommendations. But for time's sake, we're not going to exhaust your time today with all of this. Building trust and legitimacy, that's a recommendation. Having proper policy in place and proper oversight. Technology and social media being a part of the interaction between police and the community. Community policing and crime reduction. As I mentioned on yesterday, the majority of the police don't even live in the neighborhoods they police. It's foreign to them. Officer training and education. With the FBI, if you're going to be an FBI agent, it requires a college degree. And even if you're selected, it still requires extensive training before you can be deemed an agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And yet, in many police departments, training in terms of tactical things, but what about training in terms of community policing, in terms of the social, emotional dynamics within certain neighborhoods? about the struggles, the history of certain communities, about training the history, teaching the history of policing in the United States. A sixth component that was recommended was for the officers' safety and wellness. You want the police to be community minded, but you also want the police to be safe. You want the police to feel okay going into a community and not day by day feel like they're going into a combat zone where their anxiety is already elevated, to where if they feel stressed out, if they feel overwhelmed, they are empowered to seek mental health assistance without fear of retribution. And then finally, some people will accept the counsel and some will just reject it. Some people would look back at President Obama's task force on policing, and they did. And they said, these are excellent recommendations. But then there was a group of people that if President Obama said yes, they said no. If he said right, they said left. If he said up, they said down. If he said in, they said out. Because the mindset was, we will not support anything, even if it makes sense, that he advances. In the mid 2015, right up the road in Montgomery County, Maryland, the Montgomery County Police Chief at that time, Tom Manager, took the many tragic events that were occurring in cities around the country as a cue to meet with the Montgomery County Council for a discussion about policing the communities. The objective of the discussion was to prioritize building trust between the police force and the community. What every segment of the community wants to know is this: are we listening to them? Do we care about the services that we're providing to them, said the chief manager. In an open meeting with the county's elected officials, he said, we've got to be real with ourselves. He then expressed the police force's commitment to fairness, impartiality, and doing right by all members of the community. The Montgomery County Police Department is taking several steps to improve the police force's presence and skills. Officers are being trained to de-escalate situations, as well as consider the social economic makeup and history of different neighborhoods. And a body camera pilot program was recently approved, and now almost nationwide, body cameras are mandated by the police. It's amazing what one person, one county, one city can do that could change the trajectory of every police jurisdiction in this country. But it starts at the grassroots levels. If you are waiting on Congress, if you're waiting on the Senate, you're waiting on the wrong people. In cases like this, change starts at the bottom. You've heard the saying, all politics are local. That's where change within the police department really takes place. President Obama commissioned this task force, but then the change starts at the bottom. In the book of First Kings, chapter 12, verses 7 through 11, you remember there's a king by the name of Solomon, and he has a son by the name of Jeroboam. And Jeroboam consults two groups of people about how to better serve the people of God. The older councils replied, if you're willing to be a servant to these people today and give them a favorable answer, they will be your loyal subjects. But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the older men and instead asked the opinion of the young men who had grown up with him and were now his advisors. What is your advice? He asked them. How should I answer these people who want me to lighten their burdens that was imposed on them by my father? The young men replied, this is what you should do. Tell those complainers who want a lighter burden, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. Yes, my father laid heavy burdens on you, but I'm going to make them even heavier. My father beat you with whips, but I'm going to beat you with scorpions. You know what Rehoboam does? He rejects the counsel of the older wise men, and he accepted the foolish counsel of his peers. We are living in the 21st century, and the people who understand the times, the people who really want to redeem the times, the people who really want to make this country a better place for everybody, to make the police better, to make communities better, are saying what I shared with you in the Vollmer findings on yesterday, what I shared with you in the Montgomery County Police findings, and even what we shared with the 44th President of the United States. And funny, what we're sharing from 1 Kings chapter 12 from a king in Israel. See, this is not complicated. The challenge is, do we want to keep repeating negative history? Some will accept positive counsel and others will reject it. That is the history of the world. I hope this week's series has been enlightening. I hope it has been helpful, because what we are seeing with policing in this country is nothing new. There's always been some who want to improve it, and then there have always been others who try to sabotage improvements to keep things in a negative direction. I hope you are one of those agents of positive change. And I hope that this entire series that is found at the church's Facebook page, at the church's YouTube page, at the church's website, I hope that you will share this series. If you've never shared a series with anybody ever before, this would be the series that you would share with fellow citizens, Christians, co-workers around the country. I hope, trust, and pray that you have a great weekend. And I pray also that you will encourage the powers that be in your local communities to always be about the business of making things better and not worse. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you for giving us your word, giving us the wisdom of those who have constantly been able to read the handwriting on the wall in local communities, that have advocated for change, for improvement in the relationships between police and the community. And I pray that with the events that have unfolded in the past year, that it might be the catalyst by which we can move further and further into making the relationships between police and the local communities better. Keep us safe. Use us, Father, to your glory in the way that you choose. Through Christ I pray. Amen. Okay, I'm going to stop the share. And there are a couple, Brother Stewart, those that are on YouTube and Facebook. Uh, if there are any questions, I will yield the floor at this time. Okay. If there are no comments or questions, let me remind you that Sundays we meet at 9 o'clock a.m. for Bible study, and then we meet again at 10 o'clock for morning worship. If you've been practicing social distancing, and if you've not been in contact with someone that has the COVID-19 virus over the past 14 days, then we welcome you to come and be a part of the in-house worship. And if you cannot or you don't feel safe as of yet, let me encourage you to tune in at the YouTube site for the church, the Facebook site, or the church's web page. We look forward to seeing you this Sunday. God bless you. And again, have a great weekend.